There is something most people misunderstand about avoidant individuals. They think distance means confusion. They think silence means punishment. They think withdrawal means something went wrong with them. But in reality, avoidance is not about you. It is about regulation. It is a learned psychological strategy where closeness triggers discomfort and distance creates safety. Now here is the critical shift you must understand. You do not fix avoidance by chasing. You do not unlock connection by explaining more. You do not earn security by giving more of yourself. Because the more emotional pressure you apply, the more the avoidance system activates. And what does that system do? It pulls away, not because they don't care, but because closeness without control feels threatening to their internal balance. This is why you must understand a key behavioral truth. Avoidants reveal themselves most clearly when you stop reacting. When you stop texting. When you stop, for example, planing. When you stop trying to regulate their emotions for them, something very important happens. Their pattern becomes visible. If they are capable of genuine connection, they return with clarity and consistency. If they are driven by avoidance alone, they maintain distance without repair. Either way, truth emerges, but only when you remove pressure from the system. This is where most people lose themselves. They interpret withdrawal as loss, so they increase pursuit, they increase communication, they increase emotional investment, and in doing so, they unintentionally reinforce the very dynamic they are trying to escape. Because avoidance is not broken by intensity, it is revealed through space. Now, let's go deeper. A regulated relationship is not built on chasing. It is built on reciprocity, two nervous systems that can move toward each other without fear of collapse. But when one system is avoidant, it requires something very specific to become visible. SP. Ace without pursuit. Silence without collapse. Distance without panic. That is where the true pattern appears. Because an avoidant person who values connection will eventually bridge the gap. But an avoidant pattern that is unexamined will always default to distance, not as punishment, but as protection. And here is the most important lesson. You are not responsible for pulling someone out of their defense system. You are only responsible for recognizing what they consistently show you. Because behavior under no pressure is truth, not words, not promises, not emotional moments. Behavior under no pressure. So when you let them walk away, something powerful happens. You stop managing their emotional state. You stop shrinking yourself to maintain proximity. You stop negotiating your own needs for temporary connection. And in that space, clarity appears. Not fantasy. Not hope. Not potential. Clarity. Avoidant behavior is not randomness, it is a predictable emotion. Defense system. It follows patterns that are consistent once you understand the underlying psychology behind it. What looks like mixed signals, hot and cold behavior, or sudden emotional withdrawal is not chaos. It is structure. It is the nervous system attempting to maintain control over perceived emotional threat. At the core of avoidant behavior is discomfort with emotional closeness that feels overwhelming or intrusive. When intimacy increases, whether through deeper conversation, emotional vulnerability, or expectations of consistency, the avoidance system begins to activate protective mechanisms. These mechanisms are not consciously calculated. They are automatic responses shaped over time through experience, conditioning, and emotional learning. One of the most important things to understand is that avoidant individuals are not necessarily incapable of attachment. Instead, they often regulate attachment differently. Where others move toward closeness for safety, avoidant individuals may move toward distance for safety. This creates a paradox. The very thing that builds connection for one person can feel like pressure to another. When emotional intensity rises, the avoidance system interprets it as potential loss of autonomy. And autonomy, in this framework, is associated with safety. So the nervous system seeks relief through disengagement. That disengagement may appear as delayed responses, emotional flattening, distraction, increased independence, or even complete withdrawal. To the outside observer, it can feel personal. But internally, it is regulatory rather than relational. This is why direct emotional pursuit often fails with avoidant patterns. Increased messaging, deeper emotional explanations, or attempts to secure reassurance can unintentionally amplify the internal pressure they feel. Instead of creating closeness, it increases the perceived demand, which triggers further withdrawal. The system is not responding to logic. It is responding to emotional load. Over time, this cycle becomes predictable. Proximity creates tension. Tension creates distance. Distance restores equilibrium. And once equilibrium is restored, the avoidant individual may re-engage, not necessarily because the underlying dynamic has changed, but because the internal pressure has temporarily decreased. This is what creates the confusing push-pull experience that many people describe in these relationships. What is often misunderstood is that avoidance is not simply avoidance of the other person. It is avoidance of internal emotional activation. The presence of strong emotion, whether love, expectation, or dependency, can feel destabilizing. So the system prioritizes emotional control over relational continuity. That is why consistency can sometimes feel threatening, while distance feels calming. When you observe this pattern without emotional reactivity, something important becomes visible. The behavior is not random. It is consistent. It repeats the similar conditions. This means it can be studied, recognized, and understood rather than personalized or internalized. The key shift is moving from emotional interpretation to behavioral observation. Instead of asking, "Why are they doing this to me?" the more accurate question becomes, what conditions activate closeness versus distance in this pattern? That question removes blame and replaces it with clarity, because avoidant behavior is not designed to harm or confuse. It is designed to regulate internal emotional experience. Once you understand this, the entire dynamic changes in how you perceive it. You begin to see that closeness cannot be forced through intensity, and stability cannot be created through pursuit. The system only changes when the internal perception of safety changes, not when external pressure increases. And this is the fundamental truth. Avoidant behavior is not chaos. It is a structured emotional survival strategy that repeats until it is understood, recognized, and no longer misinterpreted as something it is not. When you stop chasing, you interrupt their control-based attachment cycle. What this means in practical psychological terms is that you remove yourself from the predictable loop that has been reinforcing the dynamic between pursuit and withdrawal. In many avoidant-leaning interactions, the cycle is not maintained by one person alone, but by the interaction between two nervous systems responding to each other. One system moves closer when uncertainty appears, and the other system creates distance when emotional intensity increases. Over time, this becomes automatic, almost like a pattern of stimulus and response rather than a conscious relational choice. Chasing behavior, whether it shows up as repeated messages, emotional explanations, reassurance seeking, or attempts to fix the disconnect, creates a specific type of relational environment. It introduces pressure into the system. From a psychological perspective, pressure 1. S not neutral. For an avoidant-leaning nervous system, pressure is often interpreted as a loss of autonomy or control. And when autonomy feels threatened, the natural regulatory response is to increase distance. This is not necessarily a decision, it is an internal recalibration aimed at restoring emotional balance. So when chasing continues, the cycle reinforces itself. The more one person pursues, the more the other withdraws. The more the other withdraws, the more uncertainty is created. And the more uncertainty is created, the stronger the urge to pursue becomes. This is why these dynamics can feel so consuming. They are self-perpetuating loops built on emotional reactivity. When you stop chasing, you introduce something the cycle is not designed to handle in its usual form: absence of reaction. Without pursuit, the system loses one half of its feedback loop. The avoidant individual no longer receives the same level of external emotional demand, and the pursuer is no longer feeding the pattern through engagement. This creates a disruption in the expected rhythm of interaction. At first, this disruption can feel uncomfortable for both sides. The person who is chasing may feel withdrawal or uncertainty because the habitual action of pursuing is no longer being used to regulate anxiety. Meanwhile, the avoidance system may experience a form of recalibration because the anticipated pressure is no longer present. This is where the pattern begins to shift, not because someone is trying harder, but because the structure that maintained the dynamic is no longer fully active. In many cases, this interruption reveals the underlying reality of the connection. Without chase-based energy, what remains is the raw level of genuine interest, consistency, and emotional capacity on the other side. If there is true relational intent, it often becomes more visible in the absence of pressure. If there is only engagement that depends on intermittent pursuit, that also becomes clear. Either way, clarity emerges from the reduction of reactive behavior. Stopping the chase is not about manipulation or strategic withdrawal. It is about removing yourself from a loop that is governed by anxiety rather than stability. It shifts the dynamic from reaction to observation. Instead of constantly adjusting your behavior based on someone else's distance, you begin to observe what naturally exists when you are no longer compensating for it. This interruption is powerful because it returns responsibility to where it actually belongs. You are no longer managing both sides of the attachment cycle. You are no longer supplying the emotional momentum that keeps the pattern alive. And in that space, you begin to see whether the connection can exist without being forced through pursuit. Ultimately, when chasing stops, the cycle does not collapse, it reveals itself. It shows whether there is mutual capacity for connection or only a pattern that required imbalance to function. And that clarity is what allows you to step out of confusion and into understanding. Avoidants reveal themselves more through distance than words. This is because verbal communication in emotionally complex dynamics is often controlled, filtered, and strategically minimal compared to behavioral communication, which tends to be automatic and less consciously managed. People can explain their intentions in many ways, but their patterns of closeness and distance expose what is actually being regulated internally. When someone has avoidant tendencies, their words may still sound reasonable, caring, or even deeply self-aware. They may say they value connection, that they need space, or that they are simply busy or overwhelmed. However, these statements alone do not define the attachment pattern. Words can be shaped by intention, social awareness, and the desire to avoid conflict. Distance, on the other hand, is harder to maintain through conscious control because it often emerges from emotion. Regulation needs rather than communication strategy. Distance is where the nervous system speaks most clearly. When emotional proximity increases, the avoidance system begins to track internal signals of discomfort. These signals are not necessarily logical thoughts, they are felt experiences such as pressure, expectation, or loss of internal space. In response, the system creates separation. That separation may appear as delayed replies, reduced emotional engagement, shorter conversations, less initiation, or sudden shifts in availability. These behaviors are not random disruptions in communication, they are consistent indicators of regulation in action. What makes distance more revealing than words is that it occurs under emotional load. Anyone can maintain a narrative when things are calm, but attachment patterns become visible when emotional demands increase. In those moments, verbal explanations often remain static, while behavior adjusts dynamically. This gap between what is said, ID, and what is consistently done is where the true pattern emerges. For example, someone may express care and interest, but when closeness requires sustained emotional presence, the behavior may shift toward withdrawal. This does not necessarily mean deception. It means that internal comfort levels are dictating external availability. The nervous system prioritizes equilibrium over relational continuity when those two are in conflict. Distance also reveals pacing preferences. Some individuals naturally move toward closeness when they feel safe, while avoidant patterns often move away when safety feels too intense or consuming. This creates a rhythm where proximity is followed by disengagement. Over time, this rhythm becomes observable, even if it is not explicitly acknowledged. The pattern repeats regardless of the words used to describe it. Another important aspect is that distance removes ambiguity. Words can be interpreted generously, especially when emotional investment is high. People often hold on to verbal reassurance even when behavior does not match it. But distance does not require interpretation in the same way. It is experienced directly. Consistent withdrawal communicates more information about capacity and comfort than any explanation given during a moment of emotional connection. When you observe avoidance through distance rather than language, you begin to see consistency as the key indicator. Not intensity, not occasional moments of closeness, but the overall pattern of movement between engagement and withdrawal. This pattern is what defines the attachment style in practice. Distance also reveals limits. It shows how much emotional closeness someone can tolerate before needing to reset. It shows whether connection expands over time or contracts under pressure. It shows whether engagement is stable or conditional on emotional distance being maintained. This is why focusing too heavily on words can create confusion in these dynamics. Words often represent intention, identity, or aspiration, while distance represents regulation, capacity, and lived behavior. One is expressive, the other is structural. Ultimately, avoidants reveal their true relational blueprint not in what they say during moments of comfort, but in how they behave when closeness increases. Distance becomes the clearest form of communication because it reflects what the system naturally does when it is no longer trying to manage perception. Emotional pressure makes avoidance stronger, not weaker. This is because emotional pressure is interpreted by the nervous system as increased demand for regulation, attention, or responsiveness. For an avoidant-leaning attachment system, that increase in demand is often experienced not as connection, but as activation of stress. And when stress activation rises, the natural response is to create distance in order to restore internal balance. It is important to understand that emotional pressure does not have to be aggressive, or confrontational to produce this effect. It can come from repeated messaging, requests for reassurance, expressions of unmet emotional needs, or even subtle expectations of consistency and closeness. What matters is not the intent behind the behavior, but how it is processed internally by the person receiving it. If the internal system associates closeness with loss of autonomy or emotional overwhelm, then even well-intended emotional engagement can feel like pressure. When pressure increases, the avoidance system does not interpret it as something to move toward. Instead, it interprets it as something to regulate away from. This is where the paradox begins. The more one person tries to secure connection through emotional intensity, the more the other person's system seeks relief through withdrawal. This is not a moral or conscious choice, it is a regulatory response designed to reduce internal discomfort. In this dynamic, emotional pressure functions like a signal that says, more is required here. But for an avoidant-leaning system, more is not always perceived as safe. More conversation can feel like overload. More emotional depth can feel like obligation. More urgency can feel like loss of space. So instead of moving closer to meet the demand, the system creates distance to reduce the intensity of the signal. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. One person increases emotional output in an attempt to stabilize the connection. The other person decreases emotional availability in response to that increase. Each action unintentionally reinforces the other. The more pressure is applied, the more avoidance is reinforced. And the more avoidance appears, the more pressure is often applied in response to the perceived distance. This loop can continue indefinitely unless one side changes the pattern. What makes emotional pressure particularly powerful is that it often comes from a place of attachment, care, or fear of loss. The intention is connection, but the impact is activation. And activation is what triggers protective distancing. So even sincere attempts to repair or deepen connection can produce the opposite effect if they are experienced as emotionally demanding. Avoidance strengthens under pressure because pressure removes the sense of choice in engagement. When interaction begins to feel obligatory rather than voluntary, the nervous system shifts into protection mode. Protection mode prioritizes autonomy, space, and emotional downregulation over relational closeness. This shift is automatic and happens before conscious reasoning can intervene. This is why calmness, space, and reduced intensity often create more openness in avoidant dynamics than repeated emotional pursuit. When pressure decreases, the system no longer needs to defend itself against overload. And when defense is not required, proximity becomes more tolerable. In that state, engagement can happen without the same internal resistance. It is also important to recognize that emotional pressure can distort perception on both sides. The person applying pressure may feel they are simply expressing care or trying to be understood, while the other person experiences that same behavior as escalation. This mismatch in perception is what makes the dynamic so difficult to navigate without awareness. Ultimately, emotional pressure does not resolve avoidance, it activates it. It does not create closeness, it creates the conditions for withdrawal. Understanding this shift is essential for recognizing why certain relational strategies fail, even when the intention behind them is connection. The system responds not to intention, but to emotional load. And when that load exceeds tolerance, distance becomes the primary form of regulation. Detachment exposes truth faster than confrontation ever will. This is because confrontation often introduces emotional intensity, interpretation, and defensive positioning into a situation, while detachment removes those variables and allows behavior to unfold without interference. When emotional energy is reduced and reactions are no longer driving the interaction, patterns become easier to observe in their natural form. In many relational dynamics, especially those involving inconsistent attachment patterns, confrontation tends to activate protection rather than clarity. When someone feels emotionally confronted, questioned, or pressured to explain their behavior, their nervous system often shifts into a defensive state. In that state, communication becomes less about transparency and more about self-protection. This can result in partial truths, vague explanations, emotional distancing, or even over-explaining that does not reflect actual behavioral intent. So while confrontation may feel like a direct path to truth, it often introduces noise into the system. Detachment, on the other hand, removes that pressure. When you are no longer reacting, pursuing, or demanding immediate emotional resolution, the other person is no longer required to regulate your emotional state. This shift changes the entire dynamic. Instead of responding to urgency, they are simply responding or not responding to your absence of urgency. That difference is critical because it reveals what remains when pressure is no longer shaping behavior. Truth in relationships is rarely found in high emotional moments. It is found in consistency over time and behavior under low pressure. When detachment is present, there is no need for performance. There is no need to manage another person's expectations in real time. What remains is natural inclination. If someone is genuinely invested, detachment often creates space for them to re-engage voluntarily, without coercion. If someone is not invested, detachment simply reveals continued distance without additional narrative. This is why detachment acts as a form of behavioral clarity. It strips away reactive cycles. It removes the push and pull dynamic that often clouds judgment. When you are no longer chasing answers, you begin to see patterns more objectively. You notice who reaches out without being prompted. You notice who maintains consistency without external pressure. You notice who only appears when emotional energy is supplied from your side. Confrontation often asks for explanation. Detachment observes behavior. Explanation can be constructed. Behavior is lived. And lived behavior, especially over time, carries more truth than any single conversation. This is not because people are intentionally deceptive, but because emotional states change the way people communicate. Under pressure, communication becomes adaptive. Under detachment, communication becomes revealing. Detachment also changes your internal state, which is equally important. When you are no longer emotionally entangled in trying to extract clarity from someone else, your perception becomes less biased by hope, fear, or urgency. You begin to interpret actions more accurately because you are no longer filling in gaps with assumptions. This internal shift is what allows external truth to become more visible. In contrast, confrontation often keeps you inside the cycle. You are still emotionally invested in getting a response, a justification, or a change in behavior. That investment can blur your ability to see patterns clearly because you are still participating in the dynamic that creates confusion. Detachment steps outside of that loop. It creates distance not only between you and the other person, but also between you and the emotional reactivity that distorts interpretation. Ultimately, detachment does not force truth to appear. It allows truth to surface naturally. It removes the conditions that encourage performance, defensiveness, or temporary adjustment. What remains is the stable pattern of behavior that exists without influence. And that stable pattern is far more honest than any explanation given under emotional pressure. This is why detachment reveals faster than confrontation. Confrontation asks for truth. Detachment shows it. Your value is revealed in your ability to remain grounded when others withdraw. This is because emotional stability under uncertainty is one of the clearest indicators of internal regulation and self-definition. When someone else becomes distant, inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable, it naturally triggers uncertainty in most people. That uncertainty can activate anxiety, urgency, or the desire to restore connection immediately. In that moment, your response becomes more revealing than anything you say about yourself. Remaining grounded does not mean you are unaffected. It means your internal state is not completely dictated by external shifts in availability or attention. When another person withdraws, there is a psychological gap created between expectation and reality. Some people rush to close that gap through pursuit, reassurance seeking, or emotional escalation. Others collapse inward emotionally, only allowing the withdrawal to define their self-worth. But groundedness is different. It is the ability to acknowledge the shift without losing internal stability or clarity. This kind of stability signals something deeper about self-value. It shows that your sense of worth is not fully dependent on immediate feedback from others. When validation is delayed or removed, you do not automatically assume rejection or deficiency. Instead, you observe the situation with a degree of emotional neutrality. That neutrality is not detachment from feeling, but detachment from reactivity. When others withdraw, it often creates a natural test of internal structure. Not a deliberate test, but a situational one. The absence of connection forces you to confront your own patterns of attachment. Do you escalate? Do you retreat into self-doubt? Do you overanalyze every interaction? Or do you remain steady, allowing behavior to reveal itself over time without forcing immediate resolution? Grounded. S in these moments is powerful because it prevents emotional distortion. When you are not grounded, withdrawal can easily be interpreted as a reflection of your value. Silence becomes rejection. Delay becomes disinterest. Distance becomes abandonment. But these interpretations are often shaped more by emotional activation than by factual evidence. Groundedness interrupts that distortion by creating space between stimulus and interpretation. From a behavioral perspective, your response to withdrawal also influences the dynamic itself. When someone withdraws and you remain emotionally steady, you are no longer feeding urgency into the system. You are no longer escalating emotional demand. This changes the interaction from reactive to observational. It allows the other person's behavior to exist without immediate correction or compensation from your side. In contrast, when groundedness is absent, withdrawal often leads to pursuit, and pursuit can unintentionally reinforce distance in certain relational patterns. This creates a cycle where instability on one side amplifies instability on the other. Groundedness breaks that cycle. It introduces consistency where there would otherwise be emotional fluctuation. More importantly, remaining grounded allows you to see clearly. You are no longer interpreting behavior through the lens of fear or loss. Instead, you are observing patterns as they are. Who returns with consistency? Who engages only under certain conditions? Who disappears without explanation? These observations become possible only when emotional reactivity is reduced. Your value, in this sense, is not something you declare. It is something that becomes visible through your behavior under pressure. Anyone can appear stable when relationships are secure and reciprocal. The real indicator of internal value is how you respond when that reciprocity is temporarily removed. Groundedness also communicates self-respect without words. It shows that your emotional state. 8 is not something that collapses when attention is reduced. It shows that you are not dependent on constant external validation to maintain internal equilibrium. This does not mean you do not care, it means your care is not dependent on instability. Ultimately, withdrawal reveals more about your internal structure than about the person who is leaving space. It exposes whether your sense of worth expands and contracts with external attention or remains anchored within you. And that anchoring is what defines true emotional strength. Because when others pull away, your stability becomes the clearest expression of your value, not through reaction, but through calm continuity.